Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. So, thank you, Henry, for your technical expertise, and thank you, Celine, for being our second. So it looks like we go from the early Sartre to the later Sartre now. So,
Yes, exactly.
um, this talk by Céline Marty from Université de Franche-Comté is Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, a social theory of the subject, useful to criticize contemporary capitalism. If you could just say a word about what you're working on, and then you can launch right into your presentation. Thank you, Celine.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Jeff. And yes, I'm working on philosophy of work of André Gorz, which is an existentialist Marxist, a little bit like Sartre. And I want to show how both are, uh, yes, all both are very interesting for current critique of capitalism. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers, Jeff and Henry, for accepting my paper. I'm glad to discuss Sartre with the international community, especially since Sartre is not much commented on in French research for many reasons we can discuss later. So slide 2, please, Jeff or Henry. Yes, thank you. This paper argues that Sartre's critique of dialectical reason builds many useful methodological theses for current critics of capitalism, mainly a subjective point of view, which explains how the subject alienates itself in material conditions, which are not only economic, that's important, and how it becomes aware of it and can overcome it. Sartre intends to adjust his concept of freedom to the concrete social reality. He thus aims at epistemologically founding Marxism, considered as a philosophy of his time, through the metaphysical and epistemological contributions of existentialism. Today, this colossal book is little read and commented on. Also, its materialist existentialism is useful for social philosophy. Indeed, it allows us to justify a social theory based on the subject. The subject is considered as the only atom of social reality, which then constitutes collective action, social groups, and classes, but which always retains a kind of freedom and can be extracted from them. Slide 3, please. Thank you. After Sartre, André Gorz uses this subjective point of view to criticize capitalist alienation, particularly at work, but also in consumption, leisure, or transport. He then builds a theory of emancipation based on the desire for autonomy of subjects. In my doctoral research on Gorz's philosophy of work, I show how he inherits Marxist existentialism from Sartre. Existentialism serves to justify the updating and adaptation of political projects to concrete subjective aspirations, which exist without always being translated into concrete projects by union or political party. Gorz justifies the desire, the need, and the experience of autonomy not as a petit bourgeois desire, but as an existential need that society should preserve. He criticizes especially the assignment and the reduction of the subject to his social function, especially to its job. I think that this kind of critique of capitalism from an existentialist point of view is very useful for explaining the contemporary suffering that capitalism causes at work in our relationship with others and in our life projects. Indeed, they are always embodied in concrete individuals who feel emotions in reaction to situations imposed on them. So in my talk, I will first explain Sartre's epistemological critique of Marxism in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, then how Gorz used it to critique the wage society, and finally, how we can use it today to update an existentialist critique of capitalism. So next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all, I will explain how Sartre wants to found Marxism through the theoretical contributions of existentialism. This is the first chapter of my thesis. I'm trying to synthesize these ideas here, but feel free to ask me questions about it to dig into the details. After the World War II, Sartre gradually became interested in Marxism, but distinguished his existentialism from it. Thanks to Merleau-Ponty, he became convinced that Marxism was the philosophy of his epoch, but that it had come to a standstill through theoretical and practical sclerosis. And that's the first quote. He then proposed to relaunch it through an epistemological critique in order to refound it theoretically and practically. First, Search for a Method develops this methodology, which the Critique of Dialectical Reason will apply. Also, Search for a Method is republished as the beginning of Critique of Dialectical Reason in 1960. This methodological text was first published separately in 1957 in Les Temps Modernes. When Sartre talks about Marxism, he is addressing the Marxism of his epoch, embodied by the intellectuals and politicians of the French Communist Party and the Soviet intellectuals. It is not so much Marx that he is aiming at. Sartre addresses in particular Lukacs' books Existentialism or Marxism, published in 1948, in the first chapter of Search called Existentialism and Marxism. Sartre does not seem to have read or to know History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, translated into French only in 1960. And that's maybe a pity, because Sartre could have agreed with Lukacs' description of the alienation of consciousness and its awareness of its alienation. Slide 5, please. Thank you. So, to summarize, Sartre criticized Marxism, especially for its social ontology. He blames the concept of class for not explaining all social reality, especially history, that is to say, changes in social reality. For him, according to him, Marxism does not account for how consciousness alienates itself and how it can become aware of its alienation to overcome it through collective action. Moreover, the concept of class is used by Marxism in a too narrow sense, since it understands it only as a work group constituted at work and composed of colleagues. It does not see the family or the neighborhood group. And that's the second quote. So Sartre blames Marxism for reducing the individual to a member of a group considered only by his place in the economic relations of production. So Sartre criticized Marxism for its economic reductionism, that is to say, for considering that the economic is enough to explain all of society. And that's the third quote. In the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre also addresses structuralism. At that time, structuralism was also developing in France, and Sartre discusses it a lot with Lévi-Strauss in Les Temps Modernes. He also criticized him for not taking into account what individuals experience inside the structures and what they do to them, what the individuals do to the structures, which can make them change, because structures can change in history. Sartre can tolerate the concept of structure only as a reconfiguration of praxis and practico-inert within the group, while Lévi-Strauss fails to explain the historical relationships between praxis and structure. In brief, structuralism and Marxism lose sight of the subject, which is the only atom of human reality for Sartre. Indeed, only individuals can act and understand history. They fail to explain how individuals make history for lack of a theory of the subject. The philosophy of history must then explain why and how individuals carry out collective actions. And that's slide 6, please. Thank you. Therefore, Sartre proposed to unblock and revitalize Marxism, especially dialectical materialism, with the theoretical contributions of existentialism. It provides another theory of the subject to explain how it alienates itself and how it can overcome its alienation. So that's a quote 4. The subject is called an individual praxis, but it is not a solitary individual. In contrast to being and nothingness, in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre allows for material conditions that alter the subject's project, diverting it from its initial goal. The cogito in the Critique is no longer refers to the for itself in its relation to the in itself, but to the for itself insofar as it extends outside itself, that is to say, into the materiality, into the time of things and the others. So the praxis is alienated by contact with other praxis and by matter, with matter, which is also the reified product of the other praxis. That is the serialization, a dialectical reality when each becomes another to the other as well as to himself. The practico-inert is a passive and anonymous form of individual alienation. The term inert means something practical, inscribed in our praxis, daily activity, but also sedimented without life, like a thing. But things do not dominate individuals in an insurmountable way. They are not purely passive, but like a passive activity, a materialized praxis. So the practico-inert is also sustained by other praxis. Alienation is not inherent in the coexistence of a multiplicity of individuals, but of dispersed individuals acting separately in a common situation of scarcity. Individuals can only overcome alienation through the collective action of the groupe en fusion. It's sometimes translated into group infusion or fused group in English. So in this group en fusion, individuals are brought together by a common cause. Group is characterized by a common praxis, an internal cohesion based on the reciprocity of its members. They undertake together to transform their situation in the direction of a common end produced as an end in itself. Sartre proposed a synthetic anthropology that explains the fate of individuals in history in a dialectical way, an understanding of history in terms of the dialectic of individual and group. He points out the value of psychoanalysis and sociology as mediating disciplines. Psychoanalysis supplies the intelligibility of the family and of childhood, and sociology, the intelligibility of different groups and not only work group. So Sartre is anti-reductionist and pluralist to understand a subject history. It is not only determined by his social place, but also his childhood, his secondary socialization at school, at work, and maybe its politicization. That's the quote 5. So the question now is, how can this be used to critique what capitalism does to individuals? This is what we will see with André Gorz. And that's the next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, in short, about the relationship between Sartre and Gorz. Gorz is born in 1923 in Austrian. He was an Austrian Jew and went to high school in Switzerland. He discovered existentialism and philosophy with Sartre, being and nothingness. He then met Sartre in 1946 in Lausanne, Switzerland. Sartre then helped him to find a job in Paris, where Gorz settled in 1949. They remained very close in the 50s. Gorz gave him the manuscript of his first philosophical essay called Fondement pour une morale, and then wrote an autobiographical novel called The Traitor, in which he recounted his relationship with existentialism and Sartre. And Sartre wrote the preface, very known as The Rats and the Men. Then they exchanged manuscripts of La morale de l'histoire, published in 59, and Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 60, which are close in many respects. In 1960, Sartre introduced Gorz to the editorial board of L'État moderne, where he was in charge of the economic and political columns. He was the leader of one of the leaders of the editorial board until 75. Gorz takes up Sartre's epistemology and metaphysics, but uses it more explicitly than Sartre to criticize the reality of capitalist existence. In his early writings, very close to Sartre, Fondement pour une morale, The Traitor, and La morale de l'histoire, Gorz criticizes work in capitalist society in the name of the conditions of existence that capitalism imposes on the subjects. He is alienated in a social function imposed and in which he reifies himself. As the subject grows older, he no longer dares to leave this contingent social function, and the possibility of change are diminished. Next slide, please. Thank you. Gorz then criticizes the alienation in capitalist work. Through the fragmentation of tasks and obedience to orders, the worker is dispossessed of the fruits of his work in which he does not recognize himself. In the 60s and the 70s, Gorz looks for ways to overcome this alienation. In order for workers to regain power over production, he suggests autogestion, that's to say workers' control, self-management, but maybe in a stronger way than the English word. So this worker control could be a way to determine the content of production and its organization. In 1980, Gorz published a book much debated and misunderstood, Farewell to the Working Class. He notes that a part of production will always remain heteronomous because of the big structures of production and the global configuration of the capitalist markets. He then looks for ways to foster autonomy outside of work, to make workers more critical at work. He proposed a workers' control and self-management of lifetime, work time, and other social time to give workers the psychological and physical resources to fight against capitalist domination. Next slide, please. Thank you. There is a lot to say about this book, but what I found interesting from an existentialist point of view is the way Gorz justifies the desire for autonomy. He blames Marxists and communists for having considered the desire for autonomy as a petit bourgeois desire for strategic reasons, since it could weaken class consciousness and collective union and politic action. On the contrary, according to Gorz, the desire of autonomy is an existential need and a revolutionary demand. Indeed, capitalist society has destroyed the experience of autonomy, both in work and in consumption. In the workplace, first of all, by stripping workers of the power to organize work, it imposed on them a fragmentation of tasks so that they neither understand nor want what they are doing, but also in consumption by dispossessing them of the means to satisfy their need autonomously. Yet they have to submit their needs to the market to satisfy them. That makes them dependent on a standardized supply determined by capitalist norm of profits, such as obsolescent production, that push them to buy back new product always and always. Gorz suggests that a non-class of non-workers has recently emerged. Indeed, recent transformation in industrial production have reduced the working class in factories, and led to the emergence of employees or part-time workers. Gorz noticed that they do not recognize themselves in their jobs and refuse to be assigned to them. They want another life than work. They claim different aspirations than those satisfied by employment, such as cultural aspiration and autonomy, free time, and different activities more important to them than the capitalist values of greed or consumer pleasure. Gorz wants to take into account what the person experiences in his relationship to work and the gap that can exist between the two. The person is not just a worker and is not entirely determined by his work. The person has expectation toward his job that can be met or disappointed, and he can change his expectations or his job. Gorz wants to explain the subject's feeling of not belonging to his job and the resulting aspirations, such as the desire to develop autonomous activities different than economic wants. This paradoxical non-class of non-workers or more than workers continues to grow today, which raises the questions: what can the existentialist critique of current capitalism be today? What can be the existentialist project of emancipation? And that's the next slide, please. Thank you. So this last part is a kind of work in progress. So I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. We can define existential Marxism as a branch of critical philosophy that emphasizes individual experience and autonomy to criticize capitalism, but in a different way than theoretical currents that give priority to institutions, economy, and social structures. The main questions could be: what mode of existence does capitalism force us to have? To what extent do they maintain forms of domination? And that's next slide, please. Thank you. Christian Arnsperger develops a critique of capitalist existence to build an ethic for post-capitalist life. He shows how capitalist projects, norms, devices, and institutions, such as economic growth, are also existential devices and mechanisms. They are inherited from a former situation and they are shaping our mentalities today. Capitalism is rooted in an economic anthropology. In Adam Smith, for example, the universal fund of the human being is reduced to two impulses. First, the need for recognition of others, and second, the desire to improve your material condition. The use of individual wealth as a means of social recognition sets up the capitalist way of life. Ansberger shows that capitalism is more than an economic and political system. It is a culture that generates the institution and people it needs to maintain itself. In Sartrean language, this capitalist culture, or we can say that this capitalist culture determines our praxis and diverts our projects. And that's the next slide, please. Thank you. To describe precisely the individual experiences of capitalism and the suffering they cause, we can look into the research of Frankfurt School. For example, Axel Honneth's research on social recognition, particularly at work, social recognition at work. And I'm particularly interested at the moment in the way in which our social protection, as it was organized in the 20th century in the wage society, constrains our ways of living. In our societies, you need to be employed full-time for your whole life in order to have benefits of full social protection. Otherwise, you will one day pay the price for your precariousness. This social protection prevents all forms of intermittent work and pluri-activity, which still existed before the 20th century. It makes full-time, lifelong employment the most important activity, the only socially legitimate activity. Since the legal working time is very high, work occupies a majority of our time and existence. We have little time and energy for unpaid activity existing outside the labor markets. We don't give ourselves the means to carry out projects that have intrinsic value for us. This is a way in which capitalism occupies our whole existence, time, and energy. The economic market and the state only value the paid and declared activity which can benefit them. This is why Gorz proposed from the 80s onward a free time society. What is a free time society? That's a society where the time spent on the social production of goods to satisfy all needs collectively would be considerably reduced because production will no longer be wasted on of poor quality. So living time would be regained for other activities that do not depend on the markets. Gorz justifies this project with Marx's image of the two reigns, the reign of necessity and the reign of freedom. The reign of necessity consists in utilitarian instrumental production to satisfy all needs as best we can. On top of this reign, the reign of freedom can develop the useless free activities that we do because we feel like it without thinking about their economic value or their usefulness in our career. According to Gorz, it is also a way to regain existential autonomy, psychological and physical resources to criticize capitalism at work and in all our existence. So it is a way to find the strength to fight about capitalist domination. I found this project of a free time society, freed from capitalist rationality, to be a stimulating perspective because it makes us see other ways of living, other activities, other values than the capitalist ones we are conditioned to. So we can discuss this now if you want. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you.